Hi, this is Miss Meloy. We are continuing to read I Survived the Sinking of the Titanic, 1912. I won the second 5 minutes, and we are just discovering how awesome the Titanic really is. If you remember, last night, George had eaten 2 plates of roast beef, a veal and ham pie, carrots sweet as candy, and a mysterious dessert called meringue pudding. But it tasted like sugary clouds. Actually, there was one thing that was missing from the Titanic: the New York Giants baseball team. George wondered what Henry would say if George said, "I need a shortstop, Artie Fletcher, right away." Probably Henry would say, "Coming right up, sir." George grinned, just thinking about it, but Aunt Daisy was not smiling at him. She looked very serious. "We have to make the most of our last 3 days at sea," Aunt Daisy said in a low voice. "I want you to promise me, George, no more trouble." George gulped. Was she really mad at him for last night? He slid down the banister of the grand staircase in the first-class lobby. How could he? How could he resist? The wood was so shiny and polished, curving around like a ride at the fair. That lady could have moved out of the way, George said. How could she? Phoebe said. She was wearing 100 pounds of diamonds. Aunt Daisy almost smiled. George could tell. No, she could never stay mad at George for long. Aunt Daisy put her face very, very close to George's. She had freckles in her nose, just like George and Phoebe. No more trouble, she repeated, tapping his chest. I don't want to have to send a telegram to your father. George's stomach tightened into a baseball. Don't tell Papa, Phoebe said. He'll send George all the way to that army school. I'll be good, George said. I'll be good. I promise. I really will. You better be, said Aunt Daisy. Chapter 3. George didn't mean to get into trouble. It's just that he got these great ideas. Like on the first day at sea, when he had climbed up the huge ladder into the crow's nest, Aunt Daisy, he yelled, waving his arms. She had looked up. She had almost fainted too. And yesterday, George had explored the entire ship. Aunt Daisy kept warning him that he'd get lost. She said the ship was like a maze, but George could always find his way. Even in the huge forest that stretched out behind their farm, Mama used to say that George had a map of the world behind his eyes. He saw the engine rooms and the boiler rooms and went up on the third-class recreation deck. He was watching some boys play marbles when he noticed that he was not alone. A little boy was staring up at him with huge eyes, the color of amber glass. See, the boy said, see? And he held out a postcard of the Statue of Liberty. He looked so proud, like he'd carved the big lady himself. George felt like he had to show him something in return, so he took his good luck charm, the Bowie knife Papa had given him for his 9th birthday. He let the little boy run, which was carved from an elk's antler. Enzo, the little boy said, puffing out his chest, pointing to himself. George said. Giorgio, the little boy cried with a smile. A man sitting near them laughed. He was reading an Italian-English dictionary and had the same huge eyes as the boy. George guessed that he was Enzo's father. Marco, he said, shaking George's hand, you are our first American friend. Marco must have been studying that dictionary pretty hard because George understood everything he said. George learned that Enzo was 4 and he'd lost his mama too, and he and Marco had come from a little town in Italy, and now they were moving to New York City. George told Marco about their farm and their trip and explained that any decent person living in New York had to be a Giants fan. For some reason, Marco thought that was really funny. When it was time for George to leave, Enzo got upset, very upset. Giorgio, he howled loud enough for the entire ship to hear. People stared and put their hands over their ears. Marco promised that they'd see George again, but Enzo would not quit howling. George had never heard anything so loud. By the time Enzo let go of George's legs, George ran back up to the suite. Aunt Daisy was practically howling too. I thought you fell overboard, she cried. But even then, she really wasn't mad. She didn't get really mad until last night. How that lady screamed when George came sliding down that banister like he was really a giant squid. George didn't mind getting yelled at. He was used to it. Not a day at school went by without Mr. Lander shouting, George, settle down! And Papa, well, he always seemed to be mad at George, but not Aunt Daisy. And being on this trip was supposed to make her happy. Happy for the first time since her husband had died last year. It had been Uncle Cliff's dream to be on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. He'd struck it rich selling automobiles and had plenty of money to pay for one of the biggest ships around.